Hello, everyone, and welcome to Adult Bible Studies. I'm your leader for this time of a Bible study. My name is Wayne Williams, and I'm glad that you could join me in this time of Bible study. We're looking at a series of lessons uh, that are taken from the book of Esther. It's a book that we don't spend a whole lot of time in, but it's a wonderful story, and it has a lot of dynamics about it that we can really take and apply to our lives today. One of the things in particular about the book of Esther is all the emotions and the feelings that are the people are dealing with. And certainly Esther here is dealing with all sorts of things as she wrestles with her faith and wrestles with what's the right thing to do and how to do it and those kinds of things. She shows a lot of faith and she shows a lot of wisdom. So, in that sense, this is a very good story for us. If you've not tuned in before, we've already had two lessons from the book of Esther. We started off with the basic story of Esther was uh, the niece of a man named Mordecai. Mordecai and his family had adopted Esther when her family was killed, and they raised her. And at a certain point in time, the king put out an edict that he was looking for a wife, and so his servants went through the different parts of the kingdom and found the most beautiful young women to bring in, and they had, for lack of a better way of putting it, a beauty contest, uh, perhaps a talent contest, perhaps all sorts of things that they used to evaluate these young women on in the pot with the for their potential to be the queen. And so Esther was chosen, and Mordecai knew that Esther, as a Jew, was still a very minority person within the kingdom of Persia. And so he advised her to keep quiet about her background, her heritage, and to not let that be something that was prominent in her relationship in the palace and that sort of thing with the king. And so she had been quiet about that. Mordecai, as her uncle, kept touch with her though, and he would constantly go to the city gate, and that was a place where he and Esther's handman, I won't say handmaiden, but it really was her steward who came, and they passed messages back and forth, and he checked in on Esther to make sure she was doing well and that sort of thing. And what we find here is Mordecai, being a Jew, faces a similar situation to what we find in Daniel and some of the other books of the Bible, where as a Jewish person, they're being coerced into uh, worshiping other gods. And as Jews, they don't do that. They say, no, we won't do that. Daniel said no. Mordecai says no. And Mordecai was refusing to bow down to Haman, who was the king's right hand man. And this, of course, made Haman very angry. And Haman uh, went to the king, got permission to issue his own edict against the Jewish people. The king seems to have at that time been kind of flippant about this and said, "Oh, okay, go ahead. They're just a small group of people within the kingdom anyway." And so Haman issues this edict that on a certain day, in all parts of the Persian Empire, everywhere there's a Jewish person, they will be put to death, men, women, and children. Well, before this edict is carried out, Mordecai goes back to Esther and gives her the message that this is taking place. And he says, Esther, here's that famous clip from the Old Testament. Who knows but that God chose you and put you in this time and place for a divine purpose. You've been chosen for a divine purpose. How many times do we think in our own lives about people who have a calling and who have been chosen to do different acts and to have different skills and have different talents? And we think God has given you that. And so Mordecai is saying that to Esther here. You've been given this opportunity to represent your people. Esther says she's very familiar with the palace laws and rules and all that sort of thing, though. And she says, Mordecai, you do realize that while I'm the queen, I can't go into the presence of the king unless he summons me. The only way I can do it is to stand outside of the court, and if he sees me, he will uh, dip the scepter to me, and I can go, and that's his invitation to come and be in his presence. If he doesn't do that, I'll be put to death. And that'll be the end of it right there. Mordecai says, but Esther, you're the only one we have to advocate for us in this situation. And so Esther asks the people to begin praying for her. Isn't that a wonderful thing? Here she faces a powerful decision, a time when she's going to have to put her all out there for her people and for her God. And she sees the importance of prayer. How many times do we really sufficiently pray before we launch into something? Uh, Sometimes not as often as we would like, right? Well, Esther was a person of faith and was able to see that the need for prayer. And so she asked the people to fast and pray, and she fasted and prayed. And then that's where it ended last week as we were thinking about dealing with fear. That is the emotion of fear. Today we're looking at chapter 7 in Esther. That was chapter 4. In chapter 7, the topic is revenge or restoration. Revenge is another one of those powerful emotions that can drive us to do things that sometimes are not very appropriate, and things that to act out of our personality and to act out of God's will and that sort of thing. Revenge is a powerful thing. But restoration is important too, and God has made a promise to his people, and he has set a lot of things in place so that his people could be restored, could be taken care of, could be sheltered under his wing. And we see that in this story of Esther. Like I said, last week's lesson was from chapter 4. This week's lesson is from chapter 7. Well, there's things that transpire between 4 and 7. In chapters 5 and 6, we find that the people pray. Esther gets her spirits up, and she has that sense of God's with her to take her into this. And she goes to the outer court, and she stands there, and the king points his scepter to her, and she comes in. And at this point, Esther shows an unbelievable amount of wisdom and savvy for how to deal with things. Talk about a politician, talk about a diplomat. She is a politician's politician and a diplomat's diplomat, because she knows just how to handle the situation. Instead of just going up to the king and blurting out, Haman has issued an edict and it's going to kill all my people. She does it subtly. She does it in a way that she can express honor of the king and yet also get around to the things that's really important. So she begins by inviting the king and Haman, his right hand man, to come to a banquet. And she prepares this banquet, and they come, and it's a wonderful time together, and they eat and they drink and they have a good time. And the king says, Esther, what is it that you want? I know you wanted something, or you wouldn't have asked to come into my presence in the throne room as you did. She said, yes, but I'm not quite ready to share that with you yet. What I'd like to do is to prepare another banquet for you and Haman tomorrow. And I'd like for you to come in for that banquet. The king says, okay, we can do that. Now Haman, boy, his head is beginning to get big. He's saying, look at me, the king's, I'm being invited to all kinds of things with the king. It seemed that the king and I are, we're buds, we're close, and we do these things together. The people see us as one, and wow, aren't I special? Well, he continues to foster a dislike for Mordecai. And he begins to, because of his inflated ego and because of his inflated sense of authority, begins to think how he can get back at Mordecai. And so he goes ahead, he plans to kill Mordecai. And he sets up a area where he will be killed, and for the way that he'll be killed, and has all these things in place and that sort of thing. In between this first banquet and the second banquet, the night before the second banquet, the king has trouble sleeping. Can you imagine that? God is working subtly behind the scenes. his spirit is moving in, even in the heart of this great king of Persia, Xerxes, and Xerxes is having trouble sleeping. So he gets up and he's kind of uh, trying to occupy himself, doing like we do, maybe picking up a book to read, that sort of thing. Well, he has a chronicler come in and to start talking about, uh, reminding him of things that are going on in the kingdom, kind of getting himself up to date, kind of like prepping. He wasn't doing like we're seeing right now in the news where our presidential candidates are prepping for debates and that sort of thing. But nonetheless, he was prepping so that he would be really aware of what was going on. And so the chronicler was reading through, and the chronicler gets to a point to where he is reminded that earlier on, back in chapter 1, Haman, Mordecai, had, while he was sitting at the gate to the city, he heard two of Xerxes' officials talking together about how they were going to kill King Xerxes. Mordecai passed that message on to Esther. She passed that message on to King. The matter was investigated. The two men were put to death, and when they were found to be guilty of this, and that was the end of the story. Nothing else happened. Well, the king, as the chronicler is reading him about all these things that have happened and reminding him, refreshing his memory, that sort of thing, he reads this account, and the king says, "What did we do to honor this man for his great service to me, preventing this assassination attempt?" And the chronicler says, "Well, there's nothing here, king, about that." And so the next morning, the king calls Haman in, and this is after Haman is the night before. The king was up, not sleeping, not able to sleep, but Haman was with his family and friends, and they were plotting and scheming on how they were going to get back at Mordecai. And they made all these plans to kill him and that sort of thing. And then the king invites Haman back into his presence the next morning, and he says, "Haman, I had the chronicler go over some of the things last night with me, and I was reminded of a situation where one of our citizens did us a great service, and we never paid homage to that person, never noticed them, never gave them any recognition whatsoever. And I want that person to be recognized. I want just to make a big deal out of this, that he really shared things that saved my life or prevented an assassination attempt." And then when the king says, Haman says, "Great, great king, I'll do whatever you want me to do." "Who is this person?" The king says, "It's Mordecai." Oh, can you imagine that? How Haman must have felt. Here was all this plotting and scheming against Mordecai, and now he's being forced by the king to honor Mordecai. In fact, he's the one who leads Mordecai on a great steed horse through the town, and as people bring him praise for for the things he has done in the service of the king. Well, Haman, that was the first time for Haman to really be brought down a peg or two. And later that night, again, Esther prepares a banquet. The king and Haman come in together, and they are feasting together, and everything's going well. King may have mentioned Mordecai and how that went. Did he get proper recognition, that kind of stuff? And the king turns again to Esther, and he says, "Tell me, Queen Esther," and there again, it's very significant that she's given the title Queen here. Queen Esther. She is acknowledged by the king as his queen. "What is it, Queen Esther, that you would desire of me?" And he tells her basically, "I'm willing to do whatever you want me to do." The phrase he uses is up to a half of my kingdom. Well, he didn't mean that literally, but at the same time, he meant, ask anything. Don't pull out the stops. Don't be inhibited about what you're asking. And Esther says, "King, I need to share with you, I am a Jew, and my people, the Jews, are facing potential extermination, annihilation, because Haman has issued this edict that they're all to be killed because he is mad at the Jewish people because they won't reverence him as he thinks he should be reverenced. Well, the king just gets furious. He gets up and he goes out to his garden. He takes a few minutes. Here's a good example of anger. The king was furious, but nonetheless, he doesn't act in that fury. He takes a moment, goes out to the garden, kind of centers his feelings and that sort of thing, thinks it through, comes back in, and he says, when he comes back in, Haman in the meantime, with the king's being away, Haman goes to Esther and basically is trying to plead for his life. Please, Esther, please soften the blow of what you've said to the king. Don't, help me with this, because I'll be killed if you don't. And because he is in too close a proximity of Esther, it said that he was kneeling beside the place where she was sitting. The king comes in and he says, are you even trying to molest the queen while I'm not here? Because the law was no one could come within 7 steps of the queen. Um, so here's Haman again. He said, "Oh no, I've just added fuel to the fire." And the king says, declares that Haman will be put to death, and he's put to death on the same instrument that he had raised up to kill Mordecai on it. So Haman's plan turns out to be his plan for his own execution and death. Revenge or restoration? That's the story. That's part of this story that we want to see. As we read this story, as we think through it, we can see God's hand moving through this time with Esther and with the king. And we can see how God subtly encouraged Esther, subtly prepared the means for that to be, gave her the wisdom and the insight on how to do this so it could be well received, and the king could be really open and positive towards her as she shared with him this. Now, I put off reading the scripture until after doing all this descriptive stuff, simply because I think the scripture will be much more meaningful to you, the story, if we read it now. So, Esther chapter 7, verses 1 and following. It says, when the king and Haman came in for the banquet, this is the first banquet with Queen Esther, the king said to her, oh no, this was the second banquet. This is the second day we've met for wine. What is your wish, Queen Esther? I'll give it to you. What do you want? I'll do anything, even give you half the kingdom. Queen Esther answered, if I please the king, and if the king wishes, give me my life. That's my wish, and the lives of my people too. That's my desire. We have been sold, I and my people, to be wiped out, killed, and destroyed. If we simply had been sold as male and female slaves, I would have said nothing. But no enemy can compensate the king for this kind of damage. Well, there's a little diplomacy in there too. She said, King, have you considered just how valuable these Jewish people in your kingdom are? I mean, they're very learned people. They're very good people. They're craftsmen. They're business people. They know how to do things. You're really, by allowing this edict to be followed through, Haman's edict, you're really doing a disservice to yourself and to the kingdom. And King Xerxes, Ahasuerus is his other name. King Ahasuerus and King Xerxes are the same person. Thinks about this for a moment, and he probably has a little mud on his face too, because he may remember when Haman came to him and he asked him about issuing this edict to get rid of this little small fringe group of people that were within the kingdom and making trouble, as he considered it. And so he's responding a little bit to his own recognition that he's done something that wasn't really good for a king to do. It says, King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is this person and where is he? Who would dare do such a thing? Like he's never heard never was totally unaware of this. Esther replied, "A man who hates an enemy, this wicked Haman." Haman was overcome with terror in the presence of the king and queen. Furious, the king got up and left the banquet for the palace garden. But Haman stood up to beg Queen Esther for his life. He saw clearly that the king's mood meant a bad end for him. Haman, there is no good news here for Haman. It's all bad news. The king returned from the palace garden to the banquet room just as Haman was kneeling on the couch where Esther was reclining. "Will you even molest the queen while I am in the house?" the king said. The words had barely left the king's mouth before Haman's face was dread. Haman was like, "Oh no." Harbona, one of the eunuchs serving the king, said, "Sir, look, there's the steak that Haman made for Mordecai, the man who spoke up and did something good for the king. It's standing at Haman's house, 75 feet high. Impale him on it," the king ordered. So they impaled Haman on the very pole that he had set up for Mordecai, and the king's anger went away. Revenge or restoration? God working through his people for his people. Even in the midst of a great kingdom where they are such a small little fringe group and have so little influence, God is able to carry them through a time of challenge and upset. Well, one little additional scripture that's added to today's lessons is one of the Psalms, Psalm 83. Listen to it, it sounds so much like this. It says, "God, don't be silent. Don't be quiet or sit still, God, because look, your enemies are growling. Those who hate you are acting arrogantly. They concoct crafty plans against your own people. They plot against the people you favor. Come on," they say. "Let's wipe them out as a nation. Let the name Israel be remembered no more. They plot with a single-minded heart. They make a covenant against you." Israel, God's chosen people, has faced threats on all sides, and yet God has been faithful to his promise and seen them through. What we see here is not revenge, but we see God's restoring his people to the rightful position of being human beings and having rights within that, even though they're a minor part of a bigger kingdom. So for you and I, we stop for a moment and think of how God might bless us and use us, and how God protects us, and how God carries us through. And we seek, as Esther did, prayerfully, carefully, to discern his will and then follow his guidance to do that which can make it all come together in a perfect way that is God's will. God bless you as you struggle with this issue this week. I know I will. Every day is a struggle to think about God's will and to think about exactly who I am, where I am, what I'm doing, and how God would have me to do that. And as we wrestle with that, I hope that you'll pray and seek God's will in all things. God bless you. Thank you for sharing this time with me today.